On April 30th, 1945, at 3:30 in the afternoon, in an underground bunker beneath the gardens of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, a 56-year-old man sat on a small sofa next to a much younger woman who had been his wife for barely 40 hours. The city of Berlin was ablaze above their heads. Soviet troops had advanced to within just a few blocks of the bunker. The dull rumble of artillery fire filtered through the 15-meter-thick reinforced concrete walls. In the preceding days, the man had formally dismissed every member of his close staff. He had written his political testament. He had dictated his final instructions to his followers. He had ordered the poisoning of his dog Blondie, a German shepherd who had been his constant companion for years, to verify that the cyanide capsules he was about to use actually worked. He was certain that the approaching troops would show him no mercy. He was also certain that he could not afford to fall into their hands alive. At 3:30 p.m., the man and his wife closed the door to their small private room. What happened in the following minutes was not witnessed by any direct observers. But when members of their staff entered a few minutes later, both bodies were lifeless. The man had a gunshot wound to his right temple. The woman had ingested cyanide. Their remains were removed from the bunker, taken to the Reich Chancellery garden, soaked in gasoline, and set alight on a makeshift pyre amidst the crossfire of Soviet shells raining down on the center of Berlin. The man who had just died was Adolf Hitler. He had led Germany for 12 years. He had dragged Europe into the most destructive war in human history. He had been directly or indirectly responsible for the deaths of more than 60 million people. He had been, for a brief period, one of the most powerful men on the planet. And he had ended his days underground, in a stifling bunker, watching the project to which he had dedicated his entire life collapse around him. But this story doesn't begin in the bunker. It begins more than half a century earlier, in a small border town between Austria and Germany, in a seemingly perfectly ordinary family, with a boy who appeared to be absolutely nothing special. This is the full story of how that boy became what he became. Not the textbook version, not the headline summary, the complete biography of a man whose name has become synonymous with modern evil. Get comfortable, dim the lights, and brace yourself, because this story is longer, more complex, and more disturbing than most people realize. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small border town in Upper Austria, situated on the banks of the Inn River, which separates Austria from Germany. He was the fourth child of Alois Hitler and Clara Polzel, although his three older children had died in infancy, a common tragedy in rural Europe at the end of the 19th century. Infant mortality was extraordinarily high in rural Europe at that time, and many families lost several children before any survived their early years. His father, Alois Hitler, was a customs official in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was a man of humble origins who had risen socially through his discipline and dedication to the empire's civil service. He was born Alois Schicklgruber in 1837, the illegitimate son of a woman named Maria Schicklgruber. The identity of his biological father was never definitively established, which would later fuel intense historical speculation about Adolf's ancestry. Some historians speculated for years that Alois's biological father might have been Jewish, a theory never proven but widely circulated that would haunt Nazi propaganda throughout the regime. At the age of 40, Alois legally changed his surname to Hitler, a variation of his stepfather Johann Georg Hiedler's surname. Alois was a strict, authoritarian man, frequently violent with his children. He had an explosive temper that manifested itself especially when he drank, which he did quite regularly. He beat his children with belts, canes, or any object he could find when he was angry. Young Adolf, according to later accounts he gave about his childhood, received regular beatings, sometimes until he lost consciousness. It was a pattern of domestic abuse that would leave deep and permanent psychological scars. According to an anecdote recounted by Adolf's sister, Paula, in an interview many years later, their mother, Clara, would silently tell her children about the beatings, marking each one in a secret notebook she kept in a locked drawer of her bedside table. as if she needed to somehow document the suffering she couldn't stop. Clara Polzel, the mother, was 23 years younger than her husband. She was, in fact, his second wife, and before marrying him, she had worked as a servant in the home of Alois's first wife. She was a sweet, shy, deeply religious woman and devotedly protective of her son, Adolf. After the death of her first 3 children, Clara developed an intensity of maternal love for young Adolf that bordered on obsessive. He was her weakness. He was her favorite. He was the absolute center of her emotional universe. This combination, a brutal and authoritarian father with an adoring and permissive mother, created in young Adolf a psychological complex that biographers have analyzed for decades. He learned to fear and hate his father. He learned to idealize and depend emotionally on his mother. And above all, he learned a lesson he would apply throughout his life. Brute force could subdue others, but affection could manipulate them. 2 different ways to obtain obedience. 2 tools he himself would later use with devastating skill. In 1895, when Adolf was 6 years old, Alois retired from the customs service. The family moved to a farm near the village of Hoffeld, where his father tried his hand at farming. The agricultural experiment was a failure. Alois lacked both the skills and the patience for farm work. He spent more time in the village tavern than in his own fields. The harvests were poor, the animals were not properly cared for, and after several years of financial losses, the family moved again, this time to Liending, a suburb of Linz, the regional capital of Upper Austria. It was in Linz that Adolf would spend the most important formative years of his childhood and early youth. During this period in Liending, one of the most painful family tragedies of Adolf's childhood occurred. His younger brother Edmund, who was only 6 years old, died of measles in February 1900. Adolf, then 10 years old, was deeply affected by this death. According to later accounts by his sister Paula, Adolf changed noticeably after Edmund's death. He became quieter, more withdrawn, and more prone to melancholy. He would spend long hours alone in the village cemetery, visiting his brother's grave. This is one of the few documented episodes from his childhood where Adolf displayed a genuine capacity for emotional pain directed toward another person. In Linz, Adolf attended the Realschule, a secondary school focused on practical sciences and commerce. His father was clear about what he wanted for his son: a secure career in the Austro-Hungarian civil service, similar to his own. Adolf, however, had other plans. Or more precisely, he had a deep and obsessive dream that would occupy his entire adolescence and the early years of his adulthood. He wanted to be an artist. He wanted to be a painter. The dispute between father and son over Adolf's professional future became one of the central conflicts in family life for years. Alois considered the idea of an artistic career absurd, irresponsible, unworthy of a serious man. Adolf, for his part, considered the bureaucratic career proposed by his father a betrayal of his genuine abilities and his deepest aspirations. Adolf had a genuine, albeit limited, talent for drawing. His high school art teachers noted his ability to reproduce buildings with reasonable technical accuracy. He had a good eye for architecture, for perspective, for the ornamental details of historical buildings. But he lacked something fundamental that separates good draftsmen from true artists: imagination, originality, the ability to depict human figures with life. His drawings of people were stiff, expressionless, almost mannequin-like. His landscapes were technically competent, but soulless. In short, he was a technical draftsman with aspirations that far exceeded his actual talent. This gap between his actual talent and his dreamed-of ambitions would mark his entire life. Adolf didn't want to be a modest technical draftsman. He wanted to be a great artist. He wanted to be recognized as a genius, and he could never honestly accept that his abilities fell short of his dreams. This inability to acknowledge his own limitations, this unwavering certainty of his own unrecognized greatness, would be a permanent psychological trait that would resurface at every stage of his life. On January 3, 1903, when Adolf was 13, his father, Alois, died suddenly. He collapsed one morning in his usual tavern and died within minutes. It was probably a massive pulmonary hemorrhage or a heart attack. For young Adolf, his father's death was a complex mix of grief and liberation. On the one hand, he lost the paternal figure who structured his family life. On the other, he lost the man who most opposed his artistic dreams. Without Alois to impose discipline, Adolf gradually began to abandon his formal studies. His academic performance, which had already been mediocre, plummeted after his father's death. He frequently missed classes. His behavior became increasingly erratic. In 1905, at the age of 16, he dropped out of secondary school without completing his studies. He would never obtain the secondary school certificate that, in Austria at the time, was essential for any respectable career. It was an academic failure that would have practical consequences for years to come. He spent the next 2 years in a kind of prolonged adolescence in Linz. He lived with his mother, who allowed him to continue this life without formal structure. He didn't work, he didn't study, he drew buildings obsessively. He went to the opera, especially the works of Richard Wagner, which would become a lifelong musical obsession. His postcards and drawings from this period show a young man with decent technical skills, but no sign of the genius he believed he possessed. He wandered the streets of Linz, fantasizing about the great artist he would one day be, dreaming of future successes that would retrospectively justify his rejection of conventional work. During this period, Adolf developed his first significant friendship with a young man named August Kubizek. Kubizek was the son of an upholsterer and, like Adolf, had artistic aspirations, though his were musical. They shared a passion for opera, for the music of Wagner, and for long philosophical conversations about art and destiny. Decades later, Kubizek left a memoir about his friendship with the young Hitler, a document that has become one of the most important sources for understanding the psychology of the adolescent Adolf. According to Kubizek, Adolf already displayed many of the characteristics that would dominate his adult personality: long monologues in which he would not tolerate interruptions, absolute certainty on subjects he barely knew, and the capacity to enter into intense emotional states, followed by periods of crushing melancholy. In 1907, he decided it was time to make his dream a reality. He moved to Vienna, the cultural capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and one of the great capitals of Europe at the time. He brought with him a small pension his mother paid him monthly and the modest sum remaining from his inheritance. His goal was simple: to take the entrance exams for the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. He expected to be admitted without difficulty. He was confident in his talent. The Vienna Academy of Fine Arts was one of the most prestigious art institutions in Europe. Every year, hundreds of young hopefuls took its entrance exams. Only a few dozen were admitted. Adolf arrived in Vienna in September 1907, confident, almost arrogant. He submitted his portfolio of his best architectural drawings. He awaited the result with the absolute confidence of someone who had never considered the possibility of rejection. It was rejected. The examiner's formal report, which would be obsessively studied by biographers decades later, contained a specific phrase that would forever mark Adolf: unsatisfactory drawing sample, few human figures. Adolf wasn't considered good enough even to begin formal studies. The Academy suggested instead that he try architecture school, since his architectural drawings showed more promise. But to get into architecture, he needed the high school diploma he had abandoned years before. It was a solution that ironically required undoing the academic failure he himself had created. Adolf didn't tell his mother about the rejection. He stayed in Vienna, pretending he was studying at the academy. He lived off the allowance she continued to send him. He visited museums and opera houses. He drew. He mentally prepared himself to take the exam again the following year. He lived in a modest rented room, maintaining a daily routine he considered bohemian, but which was in reality simply idle. He slept late, he walked the streets of Vienna for hours, he attended cheap opera performances in the upper floors of the State Theater, and he constantly lied, both to his mother in his letters and to the casual acquaintances he met, about his supposed status as an academy student. In December 1907, his mother, Clara, died of breast cancer. She had been ill for months, undergoing primitive and painful treatments administered by a local Jewish doctor, Dr. Edward Bloch. Adolf returned to Linz for his mother's final days and for her funeral. The emotional blow was devastating. Clara had been the only true emotional anchor in Adolf's life. Dr. Bloch, who had cared for her in her last months, wrote years later that he had never seen a young man so devastated by his mother's death as Adolf Hitler. Adolf thanked the doctor profusely for his services, a gratitude that years later, during the Nazi regime, would translate into personal protection for Dr. Bloch and his family, eventually allowing them to emigrate to the United States when many other Austrian Jews were unable to escape. In 1908, Adolf again took the entrance exam for the Academy of Fine Arts. He was rejected once more. This time, the examiners didn't even allow him to proceed to the second phase of the tests. For Adolf, the rejection was catastrophic. His artistic dream was dead. And with his mother's death, he had also lost the emotional and financial support that had sustained him in Vienna. The next 5 years of Adolf Hitler's life, between 1908 and 1913, are one of the darkest and best documented periods of his biography. He lived in Vienna in conditions of extreme poverty. He moved from modest boarding houses to increasingly cheaper lodging houses, and eventually to a men's shelter in the Meidling district, where he shared a dormitory with dozens of other destitute men. It was a period of his life that he himself, decades later during the Nazi regime, would attempt to minimize or rewrite, presenting it as a time of heroic intellectual self-discovery, when in reality it had been a time of miserable failure and material deprivation. He survived by selling small hand-painted pictures and postcards depicting famous Viennese buildings, the State Opera, the Parliament, St. Stephen's Cathedral, the Hofburg Imperial Palace. A fellow hostel resident named Reinhold Hainisch acted as his agent, taking the pictures to frame shops and souvenir vendors, who bought them for next to nothing to resell to tourists. Adolf earned just enough to eat in soup kitchens, keep himself minimally clothed, and occasionally buy cheap opera tickets, which remained his only extravagance. His relationship with Hainisch eventually ended bitterly. Adolf accused Hainisch of keeping an unfair share of the payments. Hainisch was briefly arrested over the dispute. This breakup would be characteristic of how Adolf would end many relationships throughout his life, in dispute, with accusations of betrayal, and with no possibility of reconciliation. It was during these years in Vienna that the political ideas that would dominate the rest of his life crystallized. Vienna at that time was a city of extraordinary ethnic and political tensions. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, ruled by the Habsburg dynasty, was a complex mosaic of nationalities. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Italians, Croats, Jews, and many other groups coexisted in a state of constant tension. Viennese politics was dominated by nationalist, populist, and anti-Semitic movements that promised radical solutions to social problems. The mayor of Vienna for much of this period, Karl Lueger, was a charismatic populist whose rhetorical techniques and open anti-Semitism Adolf would obsessively study. Adolf absorbed this atmosphere like a sponge. He obsessively read political newspapers, pamphlets, and cheap books on the pseudo-scientific racial theories popular at the time. He devoured publications like Ostara, a small circulation, anti-Semitic, and pseudo-scientific magazine that championed extreme racist theories and, according to later accounts, left a permanent mark on his thinking. He attended political rallies, he listened to speeches in public parks, and slowly he formed his worldview, a mixture of extreme German nationalism, hatred of international socialist movements, and a virulent anti-Semitism that would become one of the central pillars of his future thought. However, Adolf was not yet politically active. He was just a frustrated, homeless young man, full of personal resentments that he mixed with political grievances. Fellow residents of the shelter remembered him as an odd man, silent for days on end, who would occasionally erupt into long, unsolicited tirades about politics and art. He was a marginal figure, ignored by respectable society, observed with a certain curiosity by the other outcasts with whom he shared a roof. Some of these Jewish shelter companions later left testimonies that painted a complicated picture. The Adolf of those years accepted financial favors from fellow Jews, sold his paintings through Jewish dealers, and even maintained cordial relationships with several Jewish individuals during his time at the shelter. This inconsistency between his intellectual anti-Semitism and his actual personal relationships with individual Jews would be a characteristic he would maintain for many years, until absolute power finally allowed him to act on his ideological convictions without compromise. In May 1913, after 5 years of poverty in Vienna, Adolf made a life-changing decision. He crossed the border and moved to Munich, Germany. The exact reasons for the move were never entirely clear. Adolf later claimed that he had moved out of love for German culture and to escape Vienna's decadent, multi-ethnic atmosphere. Documents discovered decades later suggest less idealistic reasons. He was evading Austrian military service, which he did not want to undertake because he did not want to serve alongside soldiers of other nationalities within the empire. Austrian authorities located him in Munich in January 1914 and briefly extradited him to Salzburg for a military medical evaluation. He was declared unfit for service due to general physical weakness, which allowed him to return to Munich. In Munich, he continued to survive in much the same way as he had in Vienna, selling modest paintings and living in cheap rented rooms. But the atmosphere was better. Munich was a genuinely German city, where he felt culturally at home for the first time in his adult life. He shared rooms with a family of tailors named Pop, who would remember him years later as a quiet, polite tenant who spent most of his time silently reading or painting. His life seemed destined to continue as a permanent marginality. But then, on July 28, 1914, an event occurred that would change not only his personal destiny, but the fate of all of Europe. The First World War broke out. For Adolf, the outbreak of war was an opportunity for absolute transformation. Photographs exist of him among the crowd in Munich's Odeonsplatz on August 2, 1914, when Germany's declaration of war against Russia was officially announced. He is there, his face turned toward the speakers, with an expression of almost religious ecstasy, cheering along with the rest of the crowd. The photograph, discovered and published decades later, would become one of the strangest documents of his biography, the precise moment when a young man with no future encountered the historical event that would give meaning to his existence. He immediately requested permission to join the German army, even though he was an Austrian citizen. Permission was granted, partly due to the administrative confusion of the time, and the German army's desire to accept all available volunteers for the anticipated brief war. He voluntarily enlisted in the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, informally known as the List Regiment after its first commander. It was October 1914. Adolf was 25 years old. What followed was, paradoxically, the happiest and most formative period of Adolf's adult life up to that point. After brief training, he was sent to the Western Front, to the Flanders region, where he participated in some of the bloodiest battles of the First World War. His first battle was at Ypres in October and November 1914, known as the First Battle of Ypres, where his regiment suffered devastating casualties. Of the approximately 3,000 soldiers with whom the regiment went into combat, only 600 survived unharmed. Adolf was one of them. He served as the regimental messenger, carrying orders between officers in the rear and soldiers in the frontline trenches. It was an extraordinarily dangerous job, requiring him to regularly cross no man's land under enemy fire. The death rate among messengers was extremely high. But Adolf, according to his fellow regiments, seemed to have a supernatural ability to dodge bullets. On multiple occasions, he survived situations where other messengers died beside him. His comrades developed a superstition about him. They called him the messenger of luck, someone whose presence seemed to protect others from imminent death. Adolf performed his duties with a dedication and bravery that astonished his officers. He received the Iron Cross Second Class in December 1914, an unusual distinction for a newly enlisted private. He received the Iron Cross First Class in August 1918, an extraordinarily rare distinction for a private. His superior, Lieutenant Hugo Gutmann, who was Jewish, recommended him for this second decoration, a historical fact that Adolf would try to downplay for the rest of his life. The irony that his highest military decoration had been awarded to him on the recommendation of a Jewish officer was precisely the kind of detail that subsequent Nazi propaganda had to suppress. During the 4 years of the war, Adolf was wounded twice. The first time, at the Battle of the Somme in October 1916, he was hit by shrapnel in the thigh. He spent 2 months in a military hospital before returning to the front. The second time, in October 1918, just weeks before the end of the war, he was temporarily blinded by mustard gas during a British chemical attack. He was evacuated to a military hospital in Pasewalk in northern Germany, where he was recovering when news of the armistice arrived. Germany's surrender on November 11, 1918, was for Adolf a personal catastrophe that rivaled any trauma he had previously experienced. He, like many other German soldiers, was absolutely convinced that Germany had not been militarily defeated. The German army was still technically in enemy territory at the time of the armistice. How could Germany have lost the war? The response that Adolf and others formulated, a response that would become one of the most destructive political myths of the 20th century, was the so-called stab in the back. According to this narrative, the German army had not been defeated on the battlefield. It had been betrayed by incompetent civilians and internal conspirators, particularly socialists, communists, and Jews, who had instigated revolts behind the lines and forced the government to sign an unnecessary and shameful armistice. This narrative was historically false. The German army had been militarily defeated. Supplies had run out, the troops were exhausted. The German high command had informed the Kaiser that victory was impossible and that an immediate armistice was essential to avoid total collapse. But historical truth didn't matter in the emotional climate of post-war Germany. What mattered was the emotional narrative, and the emotional narrative blamed internal enemies for Germany's defeat. Adolf Hitler, waking up blind in his military hospital and simultaneously learning of the armistice and the Kaiser's abdication, decided at that moment, as he would later write, that he would dedicate the rest of his life to a single task: to avenge himself on those he considered responsible for the German defeat, and to restore Germany to a position of national glory. He partially regained his sight in the following weeks, although some doctors later suspected that the blindness had a psychological rather than a strictly physical component, a hysterical reaction to the news of the armistice. After the war, Adolf returned to Munich, a city mired in the political chaos of post-war Germany. Munich had briefly been the capital of a short-lived Bavarian Soviet Republic in 1919, before being violently suppressed by federal troops and paramilitary units known as the Freikorps. The city was teeming with demobilized soldiers, right and left-wing paramilitaries, and political agitators of all stripes. It was a perfect breeding ground for political radicalization. Adolf, who was still in the army as a soldier in the Reichswehr, in a special unit dedicated to monitoring suspicious political movements, was sent in September 1919 to investigate a small political group called the German Workers' Party. It was a fringe organization with only a few dozen active members, founded by a railway mechanic named Anton Drexler. Adolf attended a meeting in a beer hall to observe and report. During the meeting, a speaker made remarks about Bavarian separatism that Adolf found offensive to his pan-German nationalism. He asked for the floor. He spoke with an intensity that surprised the party members present. His natural eloquence, hidden for years under layers of marginality and resentment, finally found a stage and an audience. Anton Drexler was so impressed that he invited him to join the party as a member. Adolf, after several days of reflection, accepted. He received membership card number 555, although he would later rewrite that story to present himself as a founding member with card number 7. In February 1920, the German Workers' Party was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, known by its German acronym, NSDAP, or more commonly as the Nazi Party. Adolf quickly became its star orator. He spoke in increasingly larger beer halls. His rhetoric, combining extreme nationalism, hatred of socialists and Jews, promises of revenge for the Treaty of Versailles, and simplistic solutions to complex economic problems, found a growing audience in a Germany ravaged by inflation, unemployment, and the bitterness of defeat. His oratorical techniques were carefully developed. He began his speeches in a low, monotone voice, gradually building emotional intensity to cathartic climaxes, where he shouted so loudly his voice cracked. He practiced these speeches in front of a mirror for hours, fine-tuning gestures, facial expressions, and hand movements. His personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, documented many of these rehearsal poses in photographs that Adolf later tried to destroy as humiliating. In 1921, Adolf formally became leader of the party after an internal power struggle in which he threatened to resign if he wasn't given absolute control. The party structure was reorganized around the Führerprinzip, the Führer principle, a single person at the top with total and absolute authority, unaccountable to committees or votes. Adolf was now the Führer of the Nazi Party. He was 32 years old. On November 8, 1923, Adolf Hitler attempted a coup d'etat. Known as the Beer Hall Putsch in Munich, it was an amateurish attempt to seize control of the Bavarian government and then march on Berlin. Hitler stormed into a political meeting at the Bürgerbrau Keller, a large Munich beer hall, where several Bavarian political leaders were present. He fired a pistol into the ceiling to attract attention and declared that the national revolution had begun. The plan was to use these Bavarian politicians, under duress if necessary, to legitimize a march on Berlin in the style of Mussolini's March on Rome the previous year. The coup was an absolute disaster. The Bavarian authorities, after initially feigning cooperation under duress, regrouped and mobilized the police. The next day, when Adolf and some 2,000 armed followers marched through the streets of Munich toward the Ministry of Defense, they were intercepted by the police. Shots were exchanged. 4 police officers and 16 Nazis were killed. Adolf, who had dislocated his shoulder during the chaos when a wounded comrade dragged him to the ground, fled the scene and was arrested 2 days later at a friend's house where he had been hiding. The treason trial that followed, in February and March of 1924, should have been the end of Adolf Hitler's political career. In any functioning country, someone who had led an armed attempt to overthrow the government would have been sentenced to a severe prison term, possibly even death. But the Bavarian judicial system of the time was deeply politicized and riddled with far-right sympathizers. Adolf turned the trial into a propaganda platform. He delivered lengthy speeches from the dock that were reproduced in the national newspapers. He presented himself not as a traitor, but as a patriot who had tried to save Germany. He attacked the Berlin government. He accused the Weimar system of being illegitimate. And miraculously, he stirred national public opinion. For the first time, his name was known outside Munich. For the first time, he was a national figure. Journalists covering the trial described his ability to transform what should have been a legal humiliation into a propaganda triumph. The chief judge, a secret sympathizer of the nationalist movement, allowed him to speak for hours without interruption. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, the minimum possible sentence for treason. He served only 8 months in extraordinarily comfortable conditions at Landsberg prison. He had a spacious cell overlooking the garden. He received regular visitors. He was allowed books and writing materials. The other prisoners showed him respect. The guards were courteous to him. He received regular packages of gifts sent by Nazi sympathizers from all over Germany. It was, in many ways, a prison experience that resembled a voluntary retirement home more than a legal punishment. During those 8 months in Landsberg, Adolf wrote, or more precisely, dictated to his personal secretary, Rudolf Hess, a book that would become one of the most infamous political texts in history, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. It was a bizarre mix of idealized autobiography, political manifesto, pseudo-scientific racial theory, and geopolitical plans for a future Germany. The book explicitly contained, written in black and white, virtually everything Adolf would attempt to do in the next 2 decades. Those who read it at the time, with a few exceptions, did not take its contents as a real plan. They considered it exaggerated political rhetoric. That underestimation would have catastrophic consequences in the years to come. Adolf was released from prison in December 1924. From that moment on, his political strategy changed completely. He would no longer attempt to seize power through armed coups. He would take it legally, through democratic elections, using the very institutions of the system he despised to destroy it from within. It was a strategy of patience that required years of organizational building, rhetorical refinement, and waiting for the right political conditions. The following years were marked by the slow reconstruction of the Nazi Party, which had been banned during Adolf's imprisonment and later legalized again. The party expanded throughout Germany, organizing itself in every region and infiltrating trade unions, veterans associations, and youth organizations. Adolf honed his oratory skills, his public appearances, and his control over party members. He carefully cultivated his public image, creating what later biographers would call the Führer myth, a messianic figure destined to save Germany, endowed with almost supernatural abilities and infallible in his judgments. But the real turning point came in October 1929 with the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange and the beginning of the Great Depression. Germany, whose economy was heavily dependent on American loans, plunged into an economic crisis of catastrophic proportions. Unemployment skyrocketed, reaching approximately 6 million people by 1932, around 30% of the workforce. Banks failed. Millions of Germans lost their savings and livelihoods. Middle-class families, once models of bourgeois stability, suddenly found themselves selling furniture to buy bread. And in this context of social despair, Adolf's radical message, with its promises of drastic solutions and its clear identification of enemies to blame, suddenly found a massive audience. In the September 1930 elections, the Nazi Party went from having 12 seats in the Reichstag to 107. This was an unprecedented political leap in modern German history. In the July 1932 elections, it reached 230 seats, becoming the largest party in Germany. After months of negotiations, intrigue, and political maneuvering among traditional conservatives who thought they could use and control Adolf Hitler, President Paul von Hindenburg, elderly and manipulated by advisors who believed they could control the Führer, appointed him Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. Adolf Hitler was 43 years old. The failed painter from Vienna, the private in the First World War, the fringe agitator from Munich, was now the head of government of one of the most powerful nations in Europe. What followed during the 12 years between 1933 and 1945 has been exhaustively documented. The rapid consolidation of power through the Reichstag fire decree in February 1933 and the Enabling Act in March of the same year. The systematic elimination of the political opposition and the banning of all other parties. The bloody purge of his own rivals within the party in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives in June 1934. The accelerated military rearmament in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, the annexation of Austria in March 1938, and the incorporation of the Czech Sudetenland in September of the same year, following the Munich Agreement. The invasion of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, and the invasion of Poland in September of the same year, the latter triggering the Second World War. The astonishing initial conquests during 1939, 1940, and the first half of 1941, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, and then the irreversible military catastrophe following the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, known as Operation Barbarossa, which soon revealed itself as a colossal strategic blunder from which Germany would never recover. The declaration of war against the United States in December 1941, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, was another decision that hastened the regime's fatal destiny. The military and political details of those 12 years are contained in thousands of books, documentaries, and historical archives. What interests us for this biography is the man behind the political and military machine. What was Adolf Hitler like in his personal life during those years of absolute power? He was obsessively disciplined in some areas and utterly chaotic in others. He was a strict vegetarian, practically never drank alcohol, didn't smoke, and forbade smoking in his presence. But he ate enormous quantities of sweets and desserts, particularly Viennese cakes that his personal pastry chef prepared for him daily. He had a particular obsession with a dessert called apple strudel that he remembered from his childhood. He suffered from chronic digestive problems, possibly linked to constant stress or his strange diet, which would leave him incapacitated for days at a time. His personal physician, Theodor Morell, administered a series of daily injections composed of vitamins, hormones, glucose, and, according to some medical documents discovered decades later, also methamphetamines and cocaine. Adolf's drug addiction during the final years of the regime is one of the most disturbing aspects of his personal biography, and medical historians continue to debate how much of his erratic behavior in his later years was due to these substances. He worked extraordinarily irregular hours. He frequently went to bed at dawn and rose at noon. He held interminable monologues during dinners that stretched until 4 or 5 in the morning, where his guests had to listen to him speak uninterrupted on whatever topic interested him at that moment: architecture, Wagner's music, racial theories, military plans, personal memoirs rewritten as needed. His generals and ministers developed techniques to stay awake during these exhausting sessions without it seeming obvious. Some even took stimulants prescribed by their own doctors to survive these nocturnal marathons. His relationship with Eva Braun, his partner for the last 14 years of his life, was strange and compartmentalized. Eva was a young woman who had worked as an assistant to his personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann. He met her when she was 17 and he was 40. They maintained a nearly clandestine relationship for years. Eva lived at the Berghof, Adolf's alpine residence in Berchtesgaden, but her existence was carefully concealed from the German public. Official photographs never showed her. Foreign politicians visiting the Führer were never introduced to her. She was a parallel existence, a woman kept in a gilded cage, whom Adolf seemed to regard more as a decorative possession than a genuine emotional companion. They were only formally married 40 hours before their joint suicide in the bunker, in what many historians have interpreted as a retroactive gesture of acknowledgement in the face of imminent death. Adolf was, in his personal relationships, a man incapable of true emotional intimacy. His close associates described him as someone who could project warmth and charisma when it suited him, but who in reality kept everyone at a distance. He had no true friends in the conventional sense. He had loyal collaborators, fanatical admirers, and fearful subordinates. His only documented genuine emotional bond, aside from the strange and limited one with Eva Braun, was with his dog Blondie, a German shepherd he received as a gift in 1941 from Martin Bormann. He spent hours with Blondie, taught her elaborate tricks, and slept with her in his bedroom during the final years of the war. The dog was, according to testimonies from his staff, the only living creature toward whom he showed affection without restraint or calculation. As the war turned against Germany, particularly after the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943, where approximately 300,000 German soldiers were killed, captured, or starved to death, Adolf increasingly withdrew from the world. He spent weeks at a time at his military headquarters, known as the Wolfslayer in East Prussia, nestled in dense forests that are now part of Poland. He studied military maps for hours. He issued unrealistic orders to his generals. He refused to accept the strategic realities his subordinates tried to explain to him, often dismissing or punishing those who dared to deliver bad news. On July 20th, 1944, a group of German military officers, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler with a bomb at a military conference at the Wolfslayer. Adolf survived by sheer luck. The bomb exploded, but a heavy table stand shielded him from the blast. He suffered only minor injuries, mainly perforated eardrums and superficial burns on his legs. But the attempt scarred him deeply psychologically. He became even more paranoid, even more distrustful, even more isolated. He ordered a massive purge of the army that resulted in the execution of approximately 5,000 officers and civilians associated with the conspiracy. Stauffenberg was executed by firing squad the same day. By early 1945, it was obvious to any rational observer that Germany had lost the war. The Soviet armies were advancing inexorably from the east. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine and were advancing from the west. German cities were being bombed to ruins. Dresden was destroyed in February 1945 in one of the most controversial bombing raids of the war, with tens of thousands of civilians killed in a single night. But Adolf refused to accept reality. He gave orders to military divisions that no longer existed. He planned counterattacks with units that were destroyed. His grip on reality disintegrated as Germany's physical resources dwindled. On January 16, 1945, Adolf moved for the last time to the Führer bunker, the underground complex beneath the gardens of the Reich Chancellery in central Berlin. It was a labyrinth of small rooms 15 meters underground, with reinforced concrete walls, noisy fans, and a constant sense of claustrophobia. The bunker was divided into two levels. The upper level, known as the Vorbunker, contained kitchens, staff quarters, and common areas. The lower level, where Adolf lived his final weeks, contained his private quarters, a small Mac room for military conferences, offices for his closest associates, and an emergency generator. There he would spend the last 100 days of his life. His final months were a strange mix of frenetic activity and utter resignation. He greeted his generals with increasingly fantastical military plans, ordering them to use armies that existed only on maps, not in reality. He held staff meetings with the military map in hand, as if Germany still had offensive capabilities. But also, in private moments, he spoke with his closest advisors about suicide as his only acceptable option. He would not allow himself to be captured alive. He would not give his enemies the satisfaction of a public trial. His physical condition visibly deteriorated during those last months. Witnesses describe a hunched man with constant tremors in his left hand, his skin pale and almost translucent from lack of sunlight. Some medical historians have speculated that he was experiencing early symptoms of Parkinson's disease, while others attribute the tremors to his prolonged use of medication administered by Dr. Morell. On April 29, 1945, in a small ceremony in the bunker, officiated by a civil servant named Walter Wagner, Adolf married Eva Braun. She was 33 years old. He was 56. Only a few people attended as witnesses, primarily Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann. The ceremony lasted only a few minutes. That same evening, he dictated his political testament, in which he blamed international Jewry for the war he himself had started, and named Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor. The next day, April 30th, 1945, at 3:30 p.m., Adolf and Eva entered the bunker's private room. What happened in the following minutes was not directly witnessed by any observers. When staff members entered shortly afterward, they found Adolf dead with a gunshot wound to his right temple, and Eva dead from cyanide poisoning. The bodies were wrapped in sheets, removed from the bunker, doused with gasoline, and set on a pyre in the Reich Chancellery garden as Soviet shells continued to rain down on Berlin. The partially charred remains were eventually found by Soviet troops who reached the bunker a few days later, and their identities were confirmed through dental records. A week after his death, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The European war was over. The Nazi experiment was over. And the man who had led Germany to that catastrophe had escaped human justice through the final act of a life that many historians have characterized as a series of evasions of responsibility, suicide in an underground bunker as everything he had built crumbled. Adolf Hitler lived 56 years. For most of his life, he was a completely marginal figure, a beaten child in Austria, a school failure, a homeless youth in Vienna, a private in a losing war. Only during the last 25 years of his life did he become the man whose name changed the 20th century. The question historians have grappled with for decades is, how could such a seemingly ordinary individual rise to such power and cause so much destruction? The answers are numerous and intertwined. The specific historical context of Germany in the 1920s and 30s, the collective trauma of the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles, the economic devastation of the Great Depression, the structural weakness of German democratic institutions, the incompetence and arrogance of the traditional elites who believed they could control Hitler, Adolf's ability to grasp and articulate the resentments and frustrations of millions. But there is also something deeper to his story, something that transcends the specific historical context. Adolf Hitler demonstrated an uncomfortable truth about human nature. He demonstrated that deeply damaged individuals, filled with personal resentment and possessing skills in emotional manipulation, can find audiences willing to follow them when social circumstances are desperate enough. He demonstrated that simple solutions, offered with sufficient rhetorical conviction to complex problems, can be irresistibly appealing to traumatized populations. And he demonstrated that democracies, without proper safeguards and without citizens committed to their values, can legally destroy themselves from within, using their own institutions against themselves. His legacy is ultimately a permanent warning. A warning about what can happen when a society loses its moral compass, when demagogues find willing audiences, when democratic institutions are not actively defended by vigilant citizens. Adolf Hitler was not an inevitable historical accident. He was the result of specific human choices made by millions of people over years. And that is what makes him more disturbing than any mythological monster. He was entirely human, and human beings, under similar circumstances, could produce him again. History does not guarantee that the lessons of the past will be learned. Only conscious people can do that work, generation after generation, watching for the early signs of the social and political processes that once produced this man, and stopping them before they produce another. Thank you for listening. If you're still awake, I hope this story has given you something to think about as you close your eyes. And if you've already fallen asleep, then this documentary has served its purpose perfectly. In any case, good night.